Trigger warning. This podcast is about grief. Whether you are newly bereaved or whether you have been stuck in grief for years, I do hope this podcast brings you some comfort. Grief is such a universal experience, but we all do it differently. This podcast is not about fixing you or forcing the healing process because there is no cure for grief. It can only be experienced, absorbed, loved and cared for. So whether you are doing it privately behind closed doors or like me, you are kicking and screaming your way through, let's support each other. My name is Louise Bates, and my hope is that this podcast shines a light on your path and gives you the strength to navigate your way through the grieving process. I'm sending you so much love and support, and I look forward to sharing this journey with you. Hello, and welcome to this episode of A Gift for Grief, the space where I explore grief with honesty, gentleness, and love. I like to think this is a place where we don't have to rush, where we don't have to fix anything, and where we can simply pause and be present with the experience of loss. Because grief is not something you get over. It's not a puzzle to solve or a problem to fix. It's something you learn to live alongside. And one of the ways we live alongside it is through the words we use. So today, I'm going to talk about the language surrounding grief, or more specifically, the euphemisms we use around death and dying. You will have heard them, for example, why do we say someone has passed away instead of simply saying they died? Why do we say they're no longer with us rather than they're dead? Why do we soften it with they won't be with us much longer, instead of plainly saying they're dying? And when you stop to think about it, it's fascinating, because death is one of the few universal experiences we all share, yet it's the one thing we seem least able to talk about. So let's talk about it. Why do we soften death with euphemisms? Part of it may be cultural, but a few generations ago, people died at home. Children grew up around it and death was visible, and the language was more direct. People used the words, he died, she's dead. It's simple, it's clear, and it's final. But in modern life, death often happens in hospitals or care facilities and out of sight. And the language shifted along with that, becoming softer, vaguer, and more distant. Another part is emotional. Words like died or dead can feel like a punch in the stomach. They land heavy. They bring us face to face with the reality that just feels too much. Euphemisms act as a kind of padding. They give us space and a little room to breathe. And then there's compassion. Sometimes when we're delivering painful news, we reach for gentler phrases because we want to protect the person we're speaking to. Saying he passed away peacefully feels kinder than he died. So euphemisms aren't all bad. They serve a purpose, but they also raise some important questions about truth, clarity, and the reality of the situation. Let's look at some of the phrases we hear most often. Passed away. This is probably the most common. It's very gentle and I've used it myself, and I don't mind when others use it. But these days, I prefer to use clear language. I will use dead, dying, or death, especially when working in the field of grief and loss, because clarity is important. Sometimes people still use the word departed, which always makes me smile because it sounds like they've caught a train or a flight, or it feels very old-fashioned, almost like a phrase from a Victorian novel. And what about they're no longer with us? This phrase focuses on absence rather than the act of dying. It suggests they've simply gone elsewhere, like stepping out of the room. You'll often hear the term crossed over, especially in spiritual or religious contexts, implying that life continues in another realm. For some, that's comforting, but for others, it just doesn't resonate. And what about they went to a better place? This one can be comforting if you believe in heaven or an afterlife, but it can also feel deeply invalidating. Because when you're grieving, it doesn't matter where they are now. What matters is that they're not here. Saying they're in a better place can feel like it dismisses your pain, your longing, and your emptiness. And here's a tip: never say it to an atheist. Then there's my all-time favourite. They lost their battle. And this one, honestly, I have strong feelings about it. Because my son Matthew had cancer. And let me tell you, he didn't lose his battle. He didn't lose anything. His body grew weaker, but his spirit, his presence, his love, those only grew stronger. To say someone lost suggests failure, weakness, and defeat. And by that logic, the people who survive are the winners, and the ones who die are the losers. That's such a brutal and unfair framing. We really need to rethink battle language when it comes to illness, because life isn't a war and death isn't losing. Another one you might hear is slipped away. This can feel gentle, and it's often used when someone dies peacefully in their sleep. That's fine, but even then, we could add the words, they slipped away and died. So there's a euphemism to soften the news, but also clarity. And here's a popular one, they're at peace now. This makes sense when someone has suffered beforehand, but it doesn't always fit every death. And then there are the newer ones, transitioned or graduated. Some people find these uplifting. Personally, I like the word graduated. It feels like something to celebrate and they've moved on to the next stage. But I appreciate it's not for everyone. So yes, euphemisms can be soft and comforting, but they can also feel like putting glitter on a coffin. Shiny on the outside, but it's still a coffin. Think about saying she passed away and then saying she died. They don't just sound different, they feel different. The first cushions the news. The second one, she died, is much more blunt. Neither is wrong, but they serve different purposes. Sometimes euphemisms shield us. Other times they stop us from facing reality. The question is, are we protecting ourselves or the person we're speaking to? Using clear language is especially important when we're talking to children. Children are still developing their vocabulary and they interpret words literally. If you tell a child, Grandma went to sleep and didn't wake up, you risk creating unnecessary fears around going to sleep. If you say, we lost Grandpa, they might think you can just go out and find him. Being clear while still being gentle helps children trust what they're told. It lays a foundation for open, honest conversations about life and death. And most importantly, it helps them begin to process reality. And children are way more resilient than we realise. Euphemisms may protect adults, but clarity protects children. Now let's talk about some of the words people use with us when we're grieving. You've probably heard some of these. At least they had a good life. It was their time. There's always a reason. They had a good innings. Or that old classic, I know how you feel. Most of the time, these phrases are well-intentioned. People want to comfort us, but they don't know how, and grief makes people uncomfortable, so they grab for anything. The problem is, these phrases often shut down the conversation instead of opening it up. If someone tells me, "I know how you feel," it cancels out my own experience, but the truth is, no one knows exactly how I feel. My grief is mine. Your grief is yours, and it's deeply personal and unique. And when someone says, "it was their time," or "there's always a reason," it can feel like they're trying to wrap grief up in a neat little bow. But grief isn't neat. It's messy, it's raw, and it doesn't always have reasons. Still, I have to remind myself, most of the time these words come from a place of care. People are doing their best. Their words may be clumsy, they may be cliché, but they usually come from a place of love. Look for the good intention behind their words. If you haven't been through grief yourself, but you want to hold space for someone who has, one of the kindest things you can do is invite them to share about their person. You might start with something as simple as, "What was their name?" And if they're open, follow up with gentle curiosity. Ask about who they were, what they loved, or what made them special. It shows you're not afraid to hear their story, and that can mean so much to a grieving person. So, what do we do with all this? Maybe the answer is to become more intentional with our words, to notice when we reach for euphemisms, to ask ourselves, am I softening this for the person I'm talking to, or am I softening it to avoid my own discomfort? Because honest language doesn't have to be harsh. It can sound like this: "She died and I miss her. He's dead and it hurts." Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is to name death for what it is. Not to be cruel, but to honour the truth of it. Because death deserves honesty, and so do the people we love. So here's my invitation for you. Notice the words you use around death. Notice the words other people use with you. Ask yourself what feels true, what feels helpful, and what feels empty. And then choose your own vocabulary. Because in grief, you get to decide. You get to say, "She passed away," or "she died." You get to say, "He transitioned," or "he's gone." What matters is not whether the words sound pretty, but whether they hold your truth. If this conversation gave you something to reflect on, or even a little comfort, I'd love it if you shared this episode with someone who might need to hear it. And if you have your own words, phrases that helps you, or ones you wish people would stop using, I'd love to hear them. Until next time, be gentle with yourself, speak with kindness, and let your words be a light both for yourself and for others walking this sacred path. Thank you for listening to this episode of A Gift for Grief. If you found it comforting, please consider subscribing to my podcast so you don't miss any future episodes. Please also leave a review because it helps others to find the show. Together we can help each other become more grief literate. To learn more about my personal journey and my 2 books on grief, visit www.louisebates.co.uk. The music on this podcast was written and recorded by my son Matthew Bates and can be found on his 2 albums, Fight Back and Kaleidoscope. And finally, if you're struggling with grief or concerned about your mental health, please reach out to your doctor. You don't have to go through this alone. Until next time, be gentle with yourself and thank you for listening.